Yes, thank you, Alex, for your presentation. You've mentioned through your presentations, you mentioned solely oil, but are you interested in gas too? If there was a deposit of gas there, would that be of interest? And the follow-on question for that, should you be successful either with oil or gas, where would it be refined? Would the intentions be to take it to Taranaki and offshore? So two questions.
Okay, I'll try the first one around the gas. We don't believe from some of the historical wells, when I mentioned those 44 wells, they were drilled to different depths and different time periods. That goes back quite a few years. There isn't a lot of information that tells us this is a very gas-charged area. So, you know, the opportunity to find a significant gas play at this point, we don't see it. I think it would be more than a surprise if that we came across that. In terms of, you know, what that future may look like down the road, I can only give you a little perspective. If we assume, you know, we make it through the exploration program and we start looking at that future, certainly, you know, early stages of any kind of new area, there's not enough production to really warrant a whole ton of infrastructure. So I believe in Taranaki, for example, they're still trucking everything, I think, most things, I could be wrong on that, to port for export. You know, depending on what this looks like down the road, what kind of production, what happens, you could be looking at pipelines. You know, if there's enough production, I guess you might look at, instead of going to Taranaki with, you may come to another port. You know, honestly, I don't know yet because we haven't given that any thought. But that'll be, we'll start talking and thinking about those probably in phase 3, because now we know something.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Alex. Can I just ask you a question? I understand that Apache Canada has a great deal of experience in the extraction method we know is fracking. Can you tell us in your first phase, the exploratory phase, will you be using and examining that extraction method during that first exploratory phase?
Sure, be happy to. We've been asked that question several times. Probably 50-50 chance. We don't know because we're not down there. And if you look at the nature of the rock that is outcropped on the surface, I mentioned that it's very highly fractured, naturally fractured. So if we find that at depth, that's one of the reasons we're looking for those that depth for the pressure. You know, we might have the opportunity to produce this without fracking. We're stimulating fracking, whatever you want to call it. We're very careful to tell everybody we're not going to make promises that we're not going to, because that would be inappropriate. We just don't know until we do the test wells. And I'll give you a bit more information around that. Certainly, this is not a shale gas play, so these are not the big water use fracs that you see there. These are, if we do have to do something to stimulate flow down there, it'll probably be about 1/10 of what you hear in the news and those items, or somewhere in that order of magnitude. So we're looking, even just our preliminary program that we look at for how we might stimulate these wells, we're looking, each one will use about 500 to 600 cubic meters of water. So we're not talking those big fracs that you hear about in the news. And again, you know, if it's naturally fractured, the other thing I will tell you, fracking is not cheap. It'll add about, you know, if we have to, $1 million or so to the cost of the wells. So from an economics perspective, you know, Apache and most companies are certainly in the business of making profit. So we're not going to do a treatment that doesn't have a return for us. So part of the test wells piece is to really understand what's down there.
Thank you. Councillor Blondell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I know you have talked to a number of groups. I know particularly Mr. Mohi today mentioned that you have been down speaking to the iwi near the site itself. And I also heard you make some comment about perhaps having a public meeting. You, of course, your company would be organising that meeting, wouldn't you? I mean, you wouldn't be expecting the regional council to do that, would you? Because it's actually none of our responsibility, in my opinion.
Right. Be happy to take advice or direction on that. I hear you. I think what we would look at, and again, it's just us, no one wants to come, there's no point having a public meeting. I think we're more interested in what our experience is from other areas where we've worked. Public meetings are great, but most people go away from a public meeting as unhappy as they came. So we'd actually be more interested in a longer-term engagement process, and if there's community interest to start building infrastructure, because frankly we're interested in say building a future. If we get to the future, we'd be more interested in having an ongoing public forum process rather than just one public meeting.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could just add another one to that. You're aware, or your advisors will be telling you about consultation.
Right.
Once the application is actually a firm one, and that will involve you in meetings. I was just going to suggest that given the interest around here today of people who of course have no right to ask questions, I wonder whether you might consider the possibility of having a public meeting, obviously under the chairmanship of an independent chairman or something, but it might then give those people an opportunity to put their questions, which are different obviously from the responsibility of councillors around the table. So that's a possibility, obviously. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll be honest, our thinking is that there's not much I'm going to be able to answer because we haven't been down there yet. What we're lovely to have, certainly willing to entertain any questions or any discussions. Again, I'm much more interested in having an ongoing forum for dialogue, someone who can sit down and do the give us some feedback, and once we find out certainly the presence or absence of oil, is there something here to talk about? And what are those issues, and how do we start talking about them?
Thank you. This is not a normal audience of council, so there is interest here, definitely. Councillor Hawke.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, can our staff just elaborate on the process in terms of the three phases? Am I right in assuming that the regional council will have a consenting responsibility for the test bores, but then if it moves beyond that to stage 2 and there's a sort of a pre-production test drilling, that there would be a separate consent required for that? And in turn, production, if it came to that?
So there would be potentially a range of consents. Probably the primary focus is on the bore drilling, so consent's required for that, whether it's test or production. There's no consent required to then take a bore into production, but associated with any bore operation, there's likely to be discharges to air, discharges to land, wastewater, stormwater, soil vegetation removal, so a whole suite of potential consents required, rules triggered in the plan. What we're seriously looking at is, rather than, there's about a page and a half of them potentially, but until we have something concrete in front of us, we can't say for sure what they might be. If there are a large number of them, we will probably look to bundle them into a single consent rather than having a range of independent consent. But at every stage a new bore is sunk, that consent requirement would come up.
So sorry, I'm a little confused. Will we do one consenting process later on this year if the seismic results justify it, and that will cover everything right through to potential production? or are there steps along the way?
No, my understanding is what will be applied for will be a consent for a test bore and no more at phase one. And if the requirement is there for further bores, that's up to Apache to make that call and come back to us and start that process again.
Okay, so there are incremental opportunities for the RMA consenting process to take place with all the safeguards that entails.
Potentially, yes.
Councillor Gilbertson.
Mr. Chairman, my question is quite possibly slightly philosophical, so you might rule it out. But hypothetically, the RMA says that you must not have adverse effects, and you could argue globally that the effects of carbon emissions are potentially catastrophic. So the question to my staff, and it would affect Apache if it was a hypothetical possibility, would be that someone could argue that the use of carbon fuels is destroying the planet, and therefore it's a very, very adverse effect on the environment, and therefore the consent should not be granted. Now, if that was granted, in theory, the oil production would stop and all have to water society collapse. But the RMA states that adverse effects must be considered. The global warming has to be considered a pretty catastrophic adverse effect. So does that hypothesis stand, or is that?
Could I correct something?
It's
certainly something that we've considered, and why it's stressed in one of my slides that what we consider is the effects of the activity. So the activity that we would be considering, as an example, would be the bore construction, not the subsequent extraction of oil and the flow-on effects from that. What you're talking about in terms of the ETS carbon issues, it was a central government issue. It's not a local government issue, and it's certainly not one that would be dealt with in a resource consent fund.
So it's not
Lobby your politicians.
No. So what we're saying is that the production of oil, assuming it got to stage 3, would not produce an adverse effect on the environment. Therefore, it is not subject to our jurisdiction under the RMA. That's really the answer.
I mean, we're talking hypothetically here, but on the basis of what we know today, yes, that's correct.